Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on the deep learning theory. So, as we know, the emergence of deep learning is one of the transformative events of the last decade and a half. And however, understanding of why and how deep learning is so successful is quite limited. And approaches for addressing this question, this riddle, they can rely on trying to connect our understanding of classical methods from statistics and machine learning to what deep learning does, or on trying to understand how the unique features of deep learning contribute to its success. And many of the approaches for trying to understand the success of deep learning consider the specific optimization approaches that we have in machine learning, such as stochastic gradient descent and how they relate to generalization performance, or to the role and importance of overparameterization that is sort of a staple and basic property of deep learning. And we have combinations of these things that lead to interesting conclusions, although I think most people will agree that the theory of deep learning is still largely a mystery to us. So today we have a diverse set of talks in our session. The three middle talks will be directly related to trying to understand the performance and success of deep learning in different approaches from different perspectives. And the last talk by Satskever will be a review on the success of deep learning, so maybe more dealing with the conundrum, with the mystery than trying to solve it. Our first talk for today is by Professor Abba Kreiger of University of Pennsylvania, who's actually visiting us in Israel right now. And Professor Abba Kreiger is Robert Steinberg Professor of Data Science and Statistics at University of Pennsylvania. And his talk title is The Relationship Between Phenotype and Genotype in Autism, a case study that blends the data and science of data science. Abba, please.
Okay, I presume everyone can hear me and see the screen. Great. Okay, so about 13, 14 years ago, Jim Simons, who's funded the Simons Foundation for Autism Research, and chose me as the principal investigator, and I, with my colleague Andreas Bouya, have been working with them, looking at statistical issues as it relates to autism over these 14 years, and in fact, and ongoing. We still have a grant that's active. And what I want to do is take just these few minutes to look at sort of the data science of data science as it relates, the data part and the science part as it relates to some studies that people have done. So this is just a case study. And the main objective here in terms of the data analysis is to see what relationship there is between the genetics on the one hand and the phenotype, which really means the outcomes, the behavior. Most notably for autism, it's social issues, repetitive behavior, and the like. So to what extent does an autistic child that is genetically impaired, to what extent does that affect that person's social behavior and so on, the degree to which it exists? So really, I'm dividing the talk in two parts. Really, the first two topics is in the first part to look at data. And the point is that one has to carefully look at data to be able to make some conclusions. The basic conclusions that we find, to people's surprise, is that the genetics really has very little effect in very little association with the standard classical measures of autism, like social awkwardness, etc. On the other hand, the genetic does have relationship to what's called motor skills. I mean, in the neuroscientists understand that motor skills is is very often associated, like in Parkinson's, with many psychiatric diseases or brain-related diseases. So that will be the first. The second is a careful look at the data. The two outcomes that come up to be highly interesting in this study is IQ on the one hand, and motor skills on the other. Those are two outcomes. And the question is, how do they relate to each other? How can we look at how they relate to each other to try to tease out the causality or implicit causality associated with it? And perhaps in a conference like this, the most important topic is the third, which is more a warning than analysis, that it's common in many areas, particularly in psychiatry, to look at these problems by somehow controlling for IQ. It's well known that people with genetic issues also have lower IQ. And so the question is, how can we remove IQ from the equation? And a study that was done and published by main authors in the Journal of Psychiatry made some claims. And the bottom line, which I'll get to, is that it's, as AI people will tell you, most notably Judea Pearl and Don Rubin, as I'll discuss, one does not try to condition out outcomes. So IQ is not a covariate, it's really an outcome, and it would be, and one gets some interesting results, hard to explain and not real when one performs a marginalization based on, say, IQ, which is an outcome. So in terms of the genes, I'm not going to get into detail. There's in a 15-minute talk, but I'm going to mainly, I'm going to call it genetic. The genes that one will really focus on is what we call LGDs. Those are likely gene disruptors. And of the roughly 2,500 autistic children, about 352 have at least one of these genes. So in essence, what I'm going to call the genetic variable is an indicator variable, which has a 1 for the 352, indicating they have a likely genetic disruptive gene, and the other remaining roughly 2,150 people are 0 because they do not. So there are other variables, and we'll see those in the charts, but we're not going to get into that level of detail in a 15-minute talk. Okay. And again, the main conclusion that we're going to draw in the first part is really that there's very little relationship between this genetic variable and what people usually associate with autism, like social effect problems, restricted and repetitive behaviors, and the like. To see that more clearly, here's a matrix where on the x-axis, one has the genetic variables. We're going to focus on the first. And on the y-axis, one has the phenotype, the behavioral data. And one can see very clearly from this that there's virtually nothing going on with all of the variables up to the top two variables. So it looks very clearly that the p-values are not particularly significant for any variable, except when you get to the top. The top has one variable, nonverbal IQ. Of course, IQ, verbal and nonverbal, are associated with each other. In autism studies, we typically use nonverbal IQ because some of the children that are being investigated are really relatively young. And the other is what I call, which I'll get to and discuss in a minute, DCDQ. DCDQ will be euphemistic in this talk for motor skills. I'll show you what that's one of the many instruments that are used in general among psychologists, but in particular, when a child is autistic, since motor skills is relevant, they often get a DCDQ test. Okay. So what is this DCDQ? I mean, what is the measure of motor skills? It's obvious from looking at these. These are motor skill-like things: throwing a ball, catching a ball, hitting a ball, jump obstacles, and the like. In this DCDQ, we're going to add up all of these 15. Since they vary from 1 to 5, someone's measure of motor skills can vary from 15 to 75, typically 50 is used as a benchmark above which people are viewed to have reasonable motor skills and below which people are viewed to have limited motor skills or deficient motor skills. So I'm going to use motor skills and DCTQ interchangeably. And so when one again looks at a map like this p-value map with, again, looking at LGDs, which are genetic against these variables, I want to know that these are not adjusted for multiplicity. I mean, in this, at Tel Aviv, multiplicity is a big issue. In this case, we argue that is even more scientific verification because our first tack was to look at this standard measure of motor skills, and we found that that was significant. These others that appear to be significant are sub-questions in other instruments, all related to motor skills. So after we found that the basic motor skill measure was significant, it got supported. So there was no really need to control for multiplicity, got supported by all of the other measures. These are sub-measures, and the others, all of these are aimed at motor skills. So motor skills is clearly related to whether you're genetically impaired, as is, as we said before, nonverbal IQ, right? So that's essentially the first. The second sort of data thing, which we found interesting, we call this a boot, is that if you look at the relationship, ignoring genetics, but if you look at the relationship between the two primary outcomes, motor skills and nonverbal IQ, one sees what we're calling this boot. In essence, there is an empty cell here. What is this implicitly saying? This is implicitly saying, we can cut this in various ways, that if you have normal IQ, normal for autistic children is 70 or 80 or above, then you can have abnormal motor skills, low values on the motor skills. So you can have abnormal motor skills or normal motor skills if your IQ is above a certain level. On the other hand, if your IQ is low, it's very, very rare that one's going to have reasonable motor skills. So this cell is very, very unpopulated relative to what one would get under independence. You can look at this in a variety of different ways. Here we're looking at it as normal motor skills. Then almost everybody has an IQ that's a normal IQ, right? So you can cut this as a 2x2 in any way that you want. And the conclusion from this boot, so to speak, is that there kind of is, if we can attribute causality a little bit loosely to this. So there are people that have no effect, i.e. they are fine both on motor skills and IQ. And if you're going to have an effect, the one that's going to be more dominant is motor skills. That's going to be hit first. And then perhaps if you also are affected in motor skills, you might also be affected in IQ. This really is just illustrating the fact that it's very rare that you're going to be affected in IQ, but not affected on motor skills, right? So it seems like motor skills, if one, so to speak, plays a more dominant role than IQ in terms of the deficiencies in these autistic children. To set up the next comment, sort of the last part, this is going to be a look at the two factors, nonverbal IQ and motor skills. And you note, if you look at their relationship to the various primary outcomes in autism, you notice that they're both correlated. So the IQ is correlated with all of these factors. People with lower IQ tend to be more deficient in terms of their communication skills and the like, and people with worse motor skills tend to be more deficient. One has to be a little bit careful. The higher IQ is better, higher motor skills are better. Typically, these scores are oriented where lower scores are better. So the higher the IQ, the lower the deficiency is going to be. So one has to be a little bit careful about how we reorient. These scales are typically oriented. Okay. So this is a typical causality map, which I'll get to a bit later as well. And so what have we observed so far to set up perhaps the most important part and the care that one has to have in these analyses? And that is that we have the genetics, and what we've shown is that the genetics are correlated with the IQ, and the genetics are related to so since this is a cause and this is an effect, one can argue, or at least in quotes, argue that the genetic affect both IQ and motor skills. It's also likely that the transmitted genetics, these are de novo, meaning that these are mutations, the genetic transmitted genetic as well as environment certainly will affect core ASD, and as we showed, also affect IQ and motor skill, right? But what we did show, which is the most critical, is that the genetic really has no bearing on the core ASD. So there was no relationship between whether you were genetically impaired and whether you were deficient in terms of your core ASDs. So here's what psychiatrists typically do, and which is common in many, many areas. And so perhaps in terms of data science, the science of it has to be, this is getting more into data science, is that since it's clear that the people who are genetically impaired have lower IQ than those that are not genetically impaired, and that might be different in the distribution on gender, on age. In this study, what they did, which was quite natural for them, is that they matched somebody who had genetic issues with somebody who didn't. They matched them based on gender, based on age, and also based on their nonverbal IQ. Okay, and when they did that, they came up with the following conclusion, which they put in quotes here because I couldn't quite understand. So their conclusion from this analysis was that what genetics does is, in fact, it mutes the effect of autism on things like social behavior and the like, right? So their estimate for whether a child has social problems or not, their estimate is that if you control for IQ, then those who are genetically impaired are better off in terms of social issues than those who are not genetically impaired. So that was hard for them to explain, and that's why they used the word muted. They couldn't quite explain it. And the point I want to make, which I'll make and I can make in a variety of ways, the point I really want to make is that this is a function of faulty analysis. This is not real. And the only reason why this is coming out is in faulty analysis. So let's look at this in a variety of different ways. Okay. So one way we can look at this is to look at the following. Another way of adjusting is to do regression. So what we can do is try to predict a autistic child's problems in terms of social behavior and the like from their genetic controlling for the IQ. And the question is, what happens when you run that analysis? So, right, so that's standard. So the effect of the gene is conditional on the IQ being fixed. The coefficient for the gene, beta LGD, is the effect holding the normal verbal IQ constant as in standard regression. When one does that, one sees, if we ran a simple regression of the genetic against these factors, you see nothing except for one variable which comes up very strongly, which is the age at which a child walks, which is part of motor skills. In fact, it's a very minor part of motor skills, because eventually, even though you might walk late, eventually you do learn how to walk. But even amongst motor skills, that's the only thing that really pops up. Nothing is going on in terms of the standard social problems. On the other hand, if we did the multiple regression, and we looked at the coefficient on LGD, we see that we're starting to get some other variables that are being significant. So the ADOS is the standard method that people use, standard instrument to measure the basic social responsibility, and you see that the LGD is now significant. So by running this multiple regression, we're finding that there are differences in social behavior. To see that, one can simply look at a variety of ways to do this. One way of looking at it is by simply looking at this graph. What's in the red are the people who are genetic. What's in the blue are the people who don't have the genetic problems. And what we know is that there's no relationship in these two groups in terms of social behavior. So the centroids, if you'd like, are really roughly at the same horizontal. But there is an impact of IQ on whether you're genetic or not. IQ, right? So what happens if we match two people, one from the non-genetic group and one from the genetic group on IQ. So these two people are matched. So because we're matching these two people, this person in the non-LGD group, higher is worse, has worse social behavior than the person who's in the LGD group. So really, by virtue of matching, what you're doing is you're creating this disparity which really doesn't exist, right? Perhaps, depends on whether there are various ways one can look at pictures. I'm more analytically inclined. Let's just simply look at the partial correlation that's going on here, right? What we know is that there's no correlation between the genetic and the social outcome. What is the partial correlation that one gets? So particularly because there's a relationship between IQ and genetic and IQ and ASD, that's inducing you're subtracting off, and that's inducing this correlation. So the correlation is really being implicitly induced by the fact that you're conditioning on IQ. So this is, in essence, instead of adjusting rather than shrinking this to zero, what you're doing is you're adjusting by subtracting off a constant amount, and that's what's creating this negative relationship. So this is more, as Don Rubin and Judea Pearl would say, it's in order to correctly estimate effects of causes on outcomes, do not condition on, adjust for, or match on other outcomes. So the nonverbal IQ is another outcome, and it would be incorrect to adjust on that particular variable. So just in summary, what have we shown? So one is that we really need to look at the data very carefully. And one finds in this case study that really the only relationship between the de novo mutations, the genetics, and the outcomes, the phenotype, is motor skills, and primarily that's in age at first walking. There's really very little else. Also, if we carefully look at what happens in these autistic children in terms of motor skills versus nonverbal IQ, we see that motor skills plays a more important role. And to conclude, when we're looking at causality, be very, very, very careful that you shouldn't be controlling for outcomes. You only should adjust for covariates. And in this particular case, as is common in psychiatry, that can often lead to conclusions that are not real. Okay, so let me stop here and see if there are any questions, answer any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Abba.
So I'm going to stop sharing, right?
Yeah, you can stop sharing. I think we have time for one question. I guess that's not really the essence of your talk, but so is autism genetic or is it not genetic ultimately?
That's an interesting question because no one, I mean, there are lots of studies. Everyone knows that it has a genetic component to it. Unlike breast cancer, most the geneticists know that there are many, many, many locations that contribute to autism, each, even the most common, in a very, very small number of people. What's interesting, which is an interesting area of research, and that we're starting to look at. It dates back to 1922. How do you measure? There's really no good answer to this question to the date. How do you measure the extent to which a disease is genetic versus not genetic? There's a 1922 paper that does it. What they really do is essentially doing it by analysis of variance, looking at the extent to which the genetic factors explain variability relative to non-genetic factors.
Mm-hmm.
As my colleague Andreas likes to point out, that measure, I mean, trivially, that measures in terms of variance. And if you did it in terms of standard deviation, you would be taking the square root, and we're getting a very, very different answer.
Right.
But we're building models. We already have 200 pages, and I'm not sure we're anywhere near the finish line, trying to build models about how the genetics works in cases where there are non-genetic causes and are genetic causes, but the genetic causes are very, very complicated. And each person might have a genetic cause, but they might be very different from each other. So it's an interesting question in the sense of there's no really good answer to it. And the literature gives you very, very different answers, from 50% to there's one paper that says it's about 10%, 5%. Mm-hmm. It's known that it has to be because in identical twins, if one has autism, then the other has a 90% chance of having autism. And it does run in families. If a child is autistic in a family, there's a 10% chance that another child will be autistic. So there's no question that there is a genetic component to it. The extent is unknown.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe deep learning will tell us how genetic autism is, although I doubt it. Thank you,
Deep
Abba.
learning, if I have a minute, deep learning has something else to say. There was an interesting study, I'll just take a minute. Interesting study by a computer scientist at MIT of Israeli origin. And what he did was he scraped the web, got 50 million parents' responses to try to find with autistic children, and trying to use what they say to build various hypotheses. So one hypothesis that exists, that actually Jim Simons also noted in his child who's autistic, is that if the temperature of the child is raised, then the child functions better than if the temperature of the child is not raised. So in terms of deep learning, I don't know, deep learning, at least machine learning, scraping the web, getting 50 million parents who are actually observing their children, just raising what their observations are, is a healthy way to lead to some very, very interesting hypotheses that can be perhaps further studied more scientifically.